measure happiness? Why are some people happier than others? And how do we improve quality of life? That's the three questions I try to solve. It's what I've been working on for the past 6-7 years. It is what I'll be working on for the next 40 years. And it's also those questions I'll be trying and addressing today. Lo siento que mi español no es demasiado suficiente para hablar en español para cosas complicadas como la felicidad. Entonces, tengo que hablar en inglés, ¿vale? English is not my first language. It is Danish. And I've noticed when I speak English, I need to concentrate more. And I get a really grumpy look on my face, which is not good when you're a happiness researcher. Also, I'm really happy to be here. It's my first time in Santiago. It's my first time in Chile. So thank you so much to the University de los Andes for hosting the event. Thank you also to Inmobiliaria FG for facilitating and inviting me. And thank you also to the Minister for joining us here today. And I think good things happen when the private sector, the education sector, and the public sector comes together to discuss these things. It's also a really exciting time to be a happiness researcher because we can see more and more countries, more and more institutions are looking at happiness. I know when people hear that we work with happiness, they imagine that our office looks somewhat like this, and we have a room full of puppies and we have a room full of ice cream. That's unfortunately not the case. It looks more like this. So our job is to look at happiness from a scientific perspective. So using data, using evidence, using studies to understand how can we improve quality of life. So when we know what we know from happiness research, how should our cities look differently? How should our policies look differently? How should our workplaces look differently? That's what we're trying to understand. And we should have a scientific approach to this. Of course, it's not easy to measure happiness, but it's not impossible. And this is the most important question for people. How do we improve quality of life? How do we get happy? So of course, we should use a scientific approach to understanding this. So beyond the Happiness Research Institute, there is a lot of organizations now working with happiness research and happiness measures. So in 2011, the United Nations passed a happiness resolution, and that asks all the countries of the world to focus more on happiness and well-being and see what they can do to improve quality of life. And it's also the UN that publishes the World Happiness Report, an annual ranking of how the different countries are faring in terms of well-being. So we also have an International Day of Happiness now. It's celebrated on March 20th, usually around the time the World Happiness Report comes out. We also have governments now embracing these softer measures for progress. Instead of just looking at, are we getting richer as people? Are we improving, increasing GDP levels? More countries are now also looking at, are people getting happier? Are we improving quality of life? I think in Europe, it's the UK that have gone the furthest in this field. So now every year there's a large survey of the Office of National Statistics looking at where in the UK are people more or less happy. Recently, we actually also saw the government in New Zealand creating a well-being budget. So now every proposal for the budget in New Zealand has to come attached with an assessment on how is this going to impact well-being for the public. So a lot of the inspiration comes from the country of Bhutan. So how many of you have heard of Bhutan? Quite a few. Okay, for those two of you that hasn't. Small country, Eastern Himalayas, even smaller than my country, Denmark, 700,000 people. But what is interesting about Bhutan from a happiness research point of view is that since the beginning of the 70s, they have navigated from something called the gross national happiness. So instead of gross national product, are we getting richer? Every political decision is based on, is this going to improve quality of life for people or not? And it's Bhutan that put happiness on the agenda at the UN. We also have a quite recent initiative coming out of the Middle East. So the lady on the right is Uhud al-Rumi. She's the Minister of State for Happiness in the United Arab Emirates. So her job is to get the Emirates to top 5 in the World Happiness Report. And I think it's interesting to see here we have one of the richest countries in the world. The UAE is the 7th richest country, saying wealth is one thing, but we're actually interested in improving quality of life. Obviously, there are challenges there with diversity, inequalities in well-being between the different groups in the country. But I think one of the reasons why we see more countries interested in these softer measures of progress is that governments are realizing that the ways we've been measuring progress is insufficient in terms of GDP levels. So here we have the development in GDP per capita in Egypt leading up to the Arab Spring. And we would see the same thing in Tunisia. So if we're just looking at wealth levels, if we're just looking at the economic development, things look like they're going well leading up in that 5-year period to the revolution. But if we look at the share of people that felt that life was good, that their lives were thriving, we see that level actually drop to 1/3. So that's from a OECD report concluding that these subjective well-being measures are better at capturing what is actually going on with the public. And I think this is a global phenomenon. I think more and more people are experiencing that we have gotten richer without necessarily getting happier. So this is a picture from Seoul, what it looked like in 1960. I was there last year, now it looks like this. They have had a tremendous growth over the past 60 years and gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest countries in the world. But they have really struggled with converting that wealth into well-being. They've gotten richer without necessarily people getting happier. There's a lot of pressure on people, the young generation in particular. They have the highest suicide rate in OECD, 3 times the level of Denmark. And interestingly, the country we get most visits from at the Happiness Research Institute is South Korea. Because they know that something is wrong. They know they need to redesign policies, redesign society. And one editor told me earlier, we've been looking at the US as the big role model. That's where we wanted to go. Now we've gone down that path, and now we're questioning whether that's the right strategy. So they are looking for new sources of inspiration. And I think this is a global phenomenon. And of course, this brings us to a key question in my work, and namely that is, how do we actually measure this very subjective, this very intangible, complex phenomenon? And it is difficult, because whether we talk about well-being, quality of life, happiness, Bienestar or Felicidad, all of those things are very wide umbrella terms. So Jens, even though we're the same nationality, Jens have one idea of what happiness is, I have another one. So what we need to do when we meet these complex wide terms is we need to break them down and look at the different components they consist of. And it's actually something we do quite often in other areas. So if we were talking about how is the Chilean economy doing, we'd also break that down into growth, GDP levels, unemployment levels, inflation, and that gives us a language to talk about how's the economy doing in Chile. So that's also what we need to do with well-being, happiness, quality of life, break it down, look at the different elements they consist of, okay? So OECD recommends that we look at least 3 different dimensions of well-being. First, we look at overall life satisfaction. So that is typically a direct question to people where you ask them to take a step back and evaluate their life. So that could be a question like, imagine the worst possible life you could live, and the best possible life you could live on a scale from 0 to 10, where do you feel you stand right now? That's also typically the dimension that is fed into the World Happiness Report. It's also a very stable answer people gives us. People would answer the same today as they did 2 weeks ago. Another dimension is called the affective dimension. So that is much more about what kind of emotions, what kind of mood we experience on a daily basis. So there we would ask people both about positive and negative emotions, what they experienced today or yesterday. So it could be, take yesterday, did you experience feeling angry, stressed, worried, sad, happy, lonely, envious? And of course, that is very volatile. We can see that there is a weekend effect on this dimension. People are happier on Fridays than they are on Mondays. But we can also see that the first dimension and the second dimension are linked. So if people have a lot of everydays with a lot of positive emotions, they also experience higher levels of life satisfaction. So the third dimension we always try and capture in our studies is called the eudaimonic dimension. And that's just the ancient Greek word for happiness. So it actually refers to what Aristotle thought the good life was. And to him, the good life was the meaningful life. So there we're looking at, do people have a sense of purpose? Okay? So those are the three dimensions we try and break it down to. Then we also like to say, listen, what is actually important for us is how people feel about their lives. So we want to put people's experience of their own life at the core of what we're trying to achieve. So to me, the only person who can tell us whether Isabel is happy or not is Isabel. And I think that is what should count. What we also do is we say, listen, yes, happiness is very subjective, and it should be, but we study a lot of phenomena that are subjective. We study stress, we study depression, we study loneliness. All of those things are about how we as individuals experience the world. So I don't see why it should be more difficult to study positive emotions compared to negative emotions. What we also like to do is we like to follow people over time. So we follow a large group of people over time to see how changes in their life circumstances impact quality of life. Because that is how we understand what is the cause and what is the effect of some of these things. So for instance, we can see that on average, people who are married are happier. But does that mean that we get happy from marriage? Or is it the other way around, that people who are happy, people who are optimistic, have an easier time getting married? We can understand that when we follow people over time. And we've done that in Germany, where we followed 10,000 people over 10 or 20 years. And there we can see over a decade, maybe 1,700 people get married. And then we start to see what happens in year 0 around the wedding. We have men are blue, we have women are red. We can see even a couple of years before, life satisfaction levels, they start to go up. You know, you meet that special someone, you find out how much you have in common. You also study at Universidad de los Andes. I do too, let's get married. And then you sort of get married, and then we reach peak happiness, and then it's sort of we adapt to happiness over time, adapt to marriage over time. But we can see that both things are true. There is a tendency that we get happier from marriage, but there is also a tendency that happier people have an easier time getting married. So we like to follow people over time. So that's how we try and measure happiness. And when we look at the factors that impact happiness, I think we can broadly talk about 3 categories. So we can see that our genetics matter. We can see we're born more or less happy. We can see that from twin studies. Identical twins have fairly similar happiness levels. But also we can see that the conditions we live under, the policies we live under, the countries we live in, the cities we live in, impact our happiness. And we can see that the behavior we have on a daily basis impact our happiness. And these 2 categories are, of course, influencing each other. So we can see that our behavior changes depending on what policies we live under and how our cities are designed. So as Churchill said, we shape our cities, we shape our buildings, and then they shape us in return. So that's why city makers, urban planners, real estate designers have a tremendously important role to play in our well-being. not only do they impact the conditions we live under, but also actually our behavior. My behavior is impacted by the city I live in and the design of that city and those buildings. So this is a key to improving not only our cities, but actually our overall well-being. And let me give you an example from Copenhagen. As we saw, the minister showed us before, the mobility index is quite high in Copenhagen. So the majority of people, they cycle to work. I cycle to work. I do not own a car because I don't need a car. The majority of members of parliament, they cycle to work. So do we do that because it's good for the environment? No, not necessarily. It's a good bonus. Do we do it because it keeps us healthy? It's also a good bonus, but it's not why we do it. We do it because it's fast, it's easy, and it's convenient to use bicycles instead of using cars. And this is an example of how policies, how urban design, how conditions impact our behavior. If I was living in London, I would not cycle as much as I do in Copenhagen. So this is key. And I really like what the minister said about integrating the different transport modes. I think this is key to achieving a high level of mobility. So what you'll see in Copenhagen is that there is integrated bike paths throughout the city. So I can go from A to B in a safe environment. I can also cross different transport modes, so I can bring my bike on the metro or on the bus. That allows me to cover a greater distance with my bike. But it's also about the little things in the infrastructure. It's about creating pedestrian or cycle bridges that cuts time, commuting time for cyclists. It's about infrastructure in terms of trash. So we all like to cycle with our bikes and drinking a cup of coffee. And when you're done with the coffee, you can throw it in a bin if it's tilted. And it's also, a nice gesture of the city to put in little infrastructure improvements like this. So when you're sitting on your bike waiting for the red light, you can rest your leg. And it's things like this that show that cyclists and pedestrians are appreciated by the city. And it's this that makes cycling a more convenient and easy exercise for people to do. So I think at the other end of the spectrum is an experience I had a couple of years ago when I was in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. They have also invested billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure. But it's infrastructure for cars and not for people. So I was staying in a hotel a few hundred meters from the botanical gardens, and I thought, okay, I'll go over there and check out the gardens. And I'm trying to walk over there, but there is no pedestrian pavement. And it becomes something that's unsafe. So I actually gave up and walked back to the hotel. And I think if you invest like that, you not only create cities for cars and not for people, but you're also telling citizens, if you do not own a car, you are a second-rate citizen. And what I like about Copenhagen is that pedestrians and cyclists, they're treated like the kings and queens of the road. They're treated like, here's something special for you. And I think this is exactly what the minister was talking about, that we create equality, we create cities that are great for everyone. And I think sometimes it's also not understood that investments for cyclists and for pedestrians, they're also good for people who drive cars, because they remove people driving cars from the roads. They reduce congestion, they reduce pollution. And I think great cities and rich cities are not cities where rich drive cars, but where rich, they walk, they use bicycles, and where rich use public transportation. I think that's the key we need to get to. We're not supposed to create more cities where everybody drives. That is definitely not the road to happiness. And this is the key question that I try to solve, that you guys need to solve as well, that we need to solve as people, as policymakers, as urban designers. And that is the key question of how do we convert wealth into well-being? how do we use our resources most efficiently in order to improve quality of life. And here we can actually use the World Happiness Report to understand some of this. So in the World Happiness Report, you will have 155 countries ranked on the average happiness level or life satisfaction level. So Chile is currently 26. The least happy countries are countries like Syria, Afghanistan, Central African Republic. The Nordic countries are often doing quite well. So Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland. You'll have New Zealand, you'll have Australia, you'll have Switzerland and the Netherlands, Canada also doing quite well. But if we look across the entire spectrum of countries, we can see there's actually quite few factors that explains the difference between happiness levels. So GDP levels matter. I'll show you in a minute. Richer countries are on average happier. But healthy life expectancy is another factor. Freedom to make life decisions, a third factor. Freedom from corruption, so good governance, is a fourth factor. The level of generosity in a society, number 5, and social support. So do we have somebody in our lives we can rely on in times of need? Those 6 factors explain 75% of the difference in happiness level. So that's also something that policymakers should focus on. So if we look at the connection between GDP levels and happiness, we actually see some of the same things as the minister showed us when it comes to GDP levels and the Human Development Index. Yes, there is a relationship. On average, richer countries are happier. But again, also with the Human Development Index, the big difference is at the bottom. So once you get to a certain level, additional national income is not going to have a huge impact on well-being levels. Chile is placed here, just around or behind Mexico. And you are actually part of a wider phenomenon that we call the South American happiness phenomenon. So when we look at countries and their GDP levels and happiness levels, there are some countries that are better at converting that wealth into well-being. And for almost all the South American countries, you are happier than you should be when we look at the socioeconomic levels. And there are different theories for that. One theory is that you have a really good social fabric. You're really good at looking out for each other. You're really good at taking care of each other. And it's something we can see impacts a large degree on happiness levels. But you also see all the Nordic countries are also above the line. The Nordic countries are also relatively good at converting wealth into well-being. When we look at the individual level between happiness and money, we see the same mechanisms here. Yes, on average, richer people are happier. These are European numbers. So we have high income outwards, low income here, and then happiness level upwards. And yes, you'll see on average, richer people are happier. But the mechanism here is being without money is a cause of unhappiness. So going from low income to middle income, big difference. Going from middle income, high income has a diminishing marginal return on happiness. And it's because the first money we get, we spend that on housing, we spend that on food. But if we're already making quite good money, if we get additional income, we spend that on things like Serenity dog pots. That doesn't really have an impact on well-being levels. So this is key. We need to create areas, we need to create cities that are good for everyone. We need to invest in bringing up the bottom half. Another reason why we see that money has less of an influence on happiness after a certain point is that people care about their social position. So people seem to care more about their relative income than their absolute income. Or put in blunt terms, it's nice to drive a BMW, but if the neighbor suddenly drives up in a Ferrari, then you're not so happy with your BMW anymore, right? So that's why we see sometimes countries get richer, but not necessarily happier because people care about where they are in the social pyramid. So, what you'll also see in Denmark is that people are paying a lot in taxes. So I pay around 50% of my income in tax. But like the majority, actually 9 out of 10 Danes, I'm happy to pay those level of taxes because we see them as investments in quality of life. We see that as investments in great building, in great infrastructure, in great education, in great healthcare. And we understand that my happiness not only depends on how I'm doing and how my family is doing, but also how my neighbor is doing and how my countryman is doing. Whether my fellow countrymen can go to the hospital if he gets sick, whether my neighbor's daughter, if she gets good enough grades, that she can go to university free of charge. I think that's the key to happiness. Investing all of us in a society, in cities, in buildings that allow all of us to flourish. And I think, again, Copenhagen is an example of that. If we look at some of the investments that have been made in urban design, in quality of life in Copenhagen, one of my favorite cases is the harbor baths. So there's been investment in cleaning up the water in the central harbor in Copenhagen. That means you can go swimming in the summer. And I mean, to be honest, our summer only lasts about 3 or 4 days, and then it's back to winter time again. But Jens, you know this, those 3 days, they're really amazing, right? But I think, again, this is an example of what the minister was talking about. Because one of my favorite activities in the summer, after work, is meet with friends and go down and have a swim in the harbor. And this is something we can all do in Copenhagen, rich or poor. It's something I can do whether I lost my job and my income tomorrow. This is something I can enjoy. This is something that is free for all. This is happiness without a price tag. And I think that is the key to great form, by the way. I think this is the key to happiness, creating great public spaces we can all enjoy whether we are rich or poor. And I think that is what the Nordic countries are doing right. I think that is what Copenhagen is doing right, removing the price tag there is for happiness. Creating great public spaces that we can all enjoy whether we are rich or poor. So earlier I mentioned social support. And we see this again and again, the importance of having great social connections. We see this in the international data, we see this in national data, and we see this in local data. Having somebody we can rely on in times of need is one of the most important keys to happiness. So we've been trying to understand how do we create good urban design that allows people or allow people's social connections to flourish. And I think one of the interesting cases here comes out of Australia, where the lady Shani on the right has done something really well in terms of taking a street and turned it into a community where they interact. So Shani lives in Holbert Street in Perth, or a suburb to Perth, an ordinary street in an ordinary neighborhood, or at least it used to be, because now they have movie nights on the street. They have pizza nights, so there's a pizza oven in the back. They come together and they bake pizza. They also have this, I'm not sure what it is, but it really looks fun. They have a community garden, and they have a goat that goes across different lawns. And I think every street should have a goat that goes across different lawns. But I've been interested in understanding how did she create this strong community in this street. And I talked with her, and she said she did essentially 2 things. So first, she got to know her neighbors. So she started to interview them about their interests and what they needed and what they had. And one guy said, I need people to help me eat mulberries or strawberries, because in the strawberry season, I have too many. And there was one kid who said, I'd love to help people babysit their pets, their cats and their dogs. And in this round, she also noticed that there were 3 ladies in the street who were interested in singing. And there was also an ex-choir mistress, so they formed the Holbert Street Choir. And that became the first step towards this community. But she also did, I think, a very important other thing. She started asking people what kind of street they would love to live in. If you're not thinking about the budget, and if you're not thinking about who's going to do what would you like to see happen in your street? What kind of street would you love to live in? And I think that is a really powerful motivator to get people dreaming about what kind of street, what kind of house, what kind of society would we like to live in. And I hope that conversation can also start here today. We've also been looking at social media and how that impacts our relationships, because I think a lot of us expect that perhaps they take up a lot of our time, and we can also see from some of the experiments we've done that they can have a negative effect on how we interact and also on our life satisfaction. And I don't know about you guys, but every time I look at Instagram and Facebook, I'm flooded with these amazing images of people getting married and running marathons and, you know, having a vacation on Bali, and this is all on the same day. And it's this really tough contrast to compare my life up against. So I think it's interesting to see how different communities are trying to embrace the new technology in a different manner. So one case is from a Danish boarding school, where when the kids arrive, all the iPhones, the iPads are taken from the kids. They're 14 to 16-year-old, and they stay at the school all the day and sleep there. So the kids have removed their phones, and then the kids are allowed to use their phones 1 hour per day. But for 23 hours, they are without their phones. And then after 6 months, it's put to a vote among the students. Should we continue with this, or should everybody get their phone back? And 80% vote to keep the system in place, because they experience when none of us have our phone, we actually create a community. We interact with the people we're with. And I think that is an interesting case, and I think it's interesting to see now also streets coming together and saying, could we perhaps say once a week that our kids are without their phones and they run out and play in the street like I used to do when I was growing up. So I think this is an interesting idea of creating this critical mass for digital detox. So now we looked at policies, we've looked at cities, we looked at streets. I also want to talk about how our homes impact our well-being. So last week, we published a new study, which is a huge study in Europe. We've looked at 10 countries. We've looked at almost 14,000 people to see how our homes impact our well-being. And this is a super interesting study because we spend more time than anywhere else in our homes, at least in Denmark. And yet how our homes impact our well-being has actually been quite unexplored until now. And the overall conclusion of the report is, to paraphrase Churchill again, we shape our homes and then they shape us in return. We can see our homes have a tremendously significant, important impact on our well-being. And what we looked at was whether people are happy with their homes, and we looked at all sorts of other factors. We looked at income, we looked at employment, we looked at gender, we looked at age, and overall we could see if people are happy with their homes, if they're satisfied with their homes, then they're also happy with life in general. So improving our homes, improving our buildings will also mean improving our life overall and improving our happiness. And we could see, when we look across all the different factors that impact our happiness, income, employment, status, relationships, 15% is explained by our homes. So 15% of our overall happiness is directly linked to how happy with our homes. So I think this is actually an overlooked potential for improving happiness for people, improving our homes. And we could also see that people are not only experiencing happiness when they're happy with their homes, but they're experiencing a whole range of other positive emotions that are necessary for being happy with their homes. Of course, safety is of key importance in some countries more than others. But we also see being proud of our homes is important for being happy with our homes. We like to invite our friends in and show the homes that we're living in. We could also see the level of comfort, having a place where we can come in, lock the door, it's a turbulent world outside, but sit down, find peace, relax, let our guard down, re-energize, and take on the world once more. So comfort, relaxation, another key emotion that people experience when they're happy with their homes. And then we could see a sense of control. So it doesn't matter so much, we can see in the data, whether you own your home or whether you rent your home. But having the ability to impact your home, having the ability to change your home, seems to be of key importance to be happy with your home. And then identity. Do we feel that our home is an extension of ourselves? Does it show our friends, our family, who we are? Does it help us tell our life narrative? We could also see that being a factor when it comes to emotions. And we looked at what are people doing and what are people lacking when they're happy or not with their homes. And we could see here there was actually quite a few misconceptions when it came to what impacts people's happiness with their homes. So a lot of people think that you need big homes to be happy with your homes. We found that's not necessarily the case. So big homes do not necessarily equal big happiness. What seems to matter more is the sense of space. So if a room seems spacious, that is far more important than the actual square meters in that home. So it's not about the square meters on paper, but it's how the home, how the room seem. So if we can create ways to have our rooms, have our homes more spacious, I think that's a much more cost-efficient way for being happy with our homes. And we could also see having a home that is adaptable. That means having a home that fits us with the different life phases that we are in is far more important than necessarily owning your own home. So I think the overall conclusion here is that the built environment, whether it's our home, whether it's our street, whether it's our cities, or whether it's the policies we live under, have a fundamental and truly important impact on our well-being. And it's something that we could and should and have a responsibility to improve. And I think it's been wonderful to have conversations with FGE and with the minister and with the university, because I think you are doing what is needed. And I'm really encouraged by meeting people like you, and also that we can attract such a big audience today. And I think it shows how much people care about creating good conditions for good lives. And that, I think, is the core of what we're all trying to achieve. And I think the first step towards that is start measuring. Because we can't manage what we don't measure. And I think if we improve our metrics, I think if we improve our measures, we also make better decisions, and that hopefully also leads to an improvement of society and overall happiness. So thank you for that.